Remember that Fantastic Four movie that was never officially released? The 1994 Fantastic Four wasn't just a low-budget superhero film.
Not a scratch on us, and the ship is in 100 pieces.
It was a cynical scheme to maintain film rights through producing the cheapest possible movie with zero intention of theatrical release. Today, we're counting down 40 wild facts about the most infamous unreleased film in comic book history that cost $1 million.
The fact that it was made for $1 million as opposed to these giant amounts of money
Fooled its entire cast and crew and became legendary bootleg, proving Hollywood could be more villainous than any comic book bad guy.
Dark side of Hollywood. The part of Hollywood that you just go, why did...
40. It was made purely to retain film rights. Producer Roger Corman's Concord Pictures created the 1994 Fantastic Four film solely to prevent Marvel film rights from reverting back to Marvel Comics.
Just tell me what is happening to us.
I'm sorry, Susan, I can't.
German producer Bernd Eichinger had purchased Fantastic Four film rights in 1986 with 7-year deadline to begin production or lose the rights.
Bernd Eichinger, a German producer who was a friend of mine, came to me, I think in September or October.
With deadline approaching and no studio interest in properly funded film, Eichinger partnered with Corman to produce cheapest possible movie that technically fulfilled contractual obligations. The film was cynical legal maneuver disguised as creative project, with no genuine intention of theatrical release from conception. This rights retention scheme established precedent still used today. 39. The entire budget was only $1 million. The complete production budget was approximately $1 million, absurdly low for superhero film, even by 1994 standards. Contemporary big-budget films like The Crow cost $23 million, while major releases spent $50 to $100 million. The microscopic budget forced extreme compromises, minimal special effects, cheap costumes, limited shooting locations, and unknown actors working for scale payments. Every aspect of production prioritized cost minimization over quality. The budget demonstrated this was never intended as legitimate theatrical release, but rather minimum viable product satisfying contractual requirements. The financial limitations were so severe, the film looked cheaper than television productions from same period. 38. The cast believed they were making real movie. Cast and crew were completely unaware the film was rights retention scheme never intended for release. Actors genuinely believed they were making legitimate superhero film that would launch their careers.
You're finished with us now.
No, 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 no! I have not!
They promoted the movie enthusiastically, gave interviews to comic book publications, and made convention appearances discussing the theatrical release. The deception was cruel. Performers invested months of work expecting professional credit and exposure, not realizing they were pawns in legal chess match. When cast members eventually discovered the truth, many felt betrayed and exploited, having worked for minimal pay under false pretenses. 37. Roger Corman directed some sequences himself. Legendary B-movie producer Roger Corman occasionally stepped in to direct sequences when production fell behind schedule, though he received no directorial credit. His involvement was purely practical, keeping production on impossibly tight schedule rather than creative contribution. Ole Sassoon received official directorial credit but had minimal experience with effects-heavy action filmmaking. Corman's guerrilla filmmaking expertise proved essential for completing production within budget and time constraints. His participation demonstrated this was classic Corman production. Make it fast, make it cheap, and whether it's actually good is entirely secondary to finishing on time and under budget. 36. The Thing costume was painfully uncomfortable. Actor Carl Ciarfalio wore the Thing costume consisting of foam rubber suit, weighing approximately 60 pounds with limited ventilation and visibility. The costume required 3 hours of application daily and caused severe heat exhaustion during filming. Ciarfalio could only perform for 20 to 30 minutes before needing to remove the costume to prevent overheating and dehydration. The suit restricted movement so severely that action sequences were nearly impossible to choreograph convincingly. The Thing's limited mobility made fight scenes look slow and unconvincing. The costume's discomfort demonstrated the budget's inadequacy. Proper creature effects required resources the production simply didn't have. 35. Principal photography lasted only 25 days. The entire film was shot in just 25 days, extraordinarily rushed schedule for effects-heavy superhero movie. Typical action films scheduled 60 to 90 days for principal photography to allow proper lighting, multiple takes, and complex action choreography. The compressed timeline meant no time for rehearsals, elaborate setups, or reshoots when scenes didn't work. Actors learned lines immediately before shooting. Blocking was determined on set, and single takes were often used regardless of quality. The rushed production showed in finished products inconsistent performances and awkward staging. The brutal schedule existed purely to minimize costs by reducing cast and crew salaries. 34. Special effects were completed in post-production hell. Visual effects were produced by multiple contractors working simultaneously without coordination, creating inconsistent quality and aesthetic across different sequences. The Human Torch's flame effects varied wildly between scenes, sometimes convincing, often laughably fake. Mr. Fantastic's stretching powers used obvious rubber prosthetics and forced perspective tricks that looked cheap. The Invisible Woman's disappearing effects were elementary blue screen work. Effects shots were completed mere weeks before the supposed release date, with no time for revisions or improvements. The fragmented effects work demonstrated how underfunding visual effects guarantees failure, regardless of crew skill or dedication. 33. Marvel Comics promoted the film extensively. Marvel Comics promoted the 1994 Fantastic Four film heavily through house advertisements, comic book previews, and convention appearances, completely unaware the film would never be released. Marvel genuinely believed this was legitimate theatrical release that would introduce Fantastic Four to mainstream audiences beyond comic readers. The company invested marketing resources expecting reciprocal film promotion to boost comic sales. When Marvel eventually discovered the rights retention scheme, they were furious at being deceived and having wasted promotional efforts on non-existent release. The deception damaged relationships between Marvel and independent producers for years afterward. 32. Dr. Doom's costume was literally spray-painted green. Dr. Doom's iconic armor was created by spray painting existing medieval knight costume green and adding minimal modifications. The cheap costume looked plastic and unconvincing, lacking the imposing presence Doom requires. The mask was poorly fitted.
I want a mask. And hey, when are we doing Doom's last shot?
Here's to the future, my friend.
With actor Joseph Culp's dialogue muffled and difficult to understand through the metal faceplate. Doom's appearance was more community theater production than credible supervillain.
Goodbye, Dr. Richards. Here's to the future, my friend.
The costume exemplified the production's fundamental problem. Iconic characters require visual investment to translate from page to screen convincingly. Spray-painted rental costumes guarantee characters look ridiculous regardless of actors' commitment to their performances. 31. The film was completed but never officially released. The film was fully completed with final editing, sound mixing, and color correction finished by late 1994. Preview screenings were scheduled for cast, crew, and Marvel executives. Promotional materials were printed and trailers were cut. Then suddenly all release plans were canceled without explanation. The cast discovered through industry rumors that their film would never see theatrical distribution. No official announcement was made. The movie simply disappeared. Producers offered no explanation to bewildered cast, who had completed publicity obligations expecting theatrical release. The mysterious cancellation fueled conspiracy theories about what had really happened behind the scenes. 30. Bootleg copies became legendary underground phenomenon. Despite no official release, bootleg VHS copies circulated extensively through comic conventions, underground trading networks, and eventually the internet. Fans who obtained bootlegs made copies for friends, creating viral distribution impossible for studios to control. The bootleg's underground reputation created mystique, far exceeding the film's actual quality. Viewers expected train wreck and got exactly that, but shared experience of watching terrible unreleased film created cult following. Bootleg distribution became more successful than any official release could have achieved. The film's unavailability paradoxically made it more famous than if it had received proper theatrical distribution. 29. Actors were paid only SAG minimum scale. All actors received Screen Actors Guild minimum scale payments, approximately $450 to $600 per day in 1994 dollars. Lead actors earned maybe $10,000 to $15,000 total for months of work, including pre-production training, filming, and post-production looping. No back-end participation or residuals were negotiated, since producers never intended theatrical release that would generate such payments. The minimal compensation meant actors worked primarily for exposure and resume credit they never received, since the film remained unreleased. Some cast members later pursued legal action, claiming fraudulent misrepresentation about the film's release intentions, though most cases were settled quietly, without admission of wrongdoing. 28. The Baxter Building was someone's office building. The Fantastic Four's headquarters, the Baxter Building, was actually a Los Angeles office building, filmed from various angles to suggest impressive skyscraper. No interior sets were constructed. All Baxter Building interior scenes were shot in rented office spaces dressed minimally with props. The lack of custom-built sets meant rooms looked like generic offices rather than superhero headquarters filled with advanced technology. Budget constraints prevented creating the technological marvel the Baxter Building represents in comics. The generic locations made the film feel like amateur production rather than professional superhero movie, destroying any sense these were extraordinary characters living in extraordinary circumstances. 27. Stan Lee refused to be associated with the film. Marvel Comics co-creator Stan Lee, who typically made enthusiastic cameo appearances in Marvel adaptations, refused involvement with the 1994 Fantastic Four film. Lee knew about the rights retention scheme and wanted no association with cynical project-exploiting characters he'd co-created. His absence was notable. Lee normally enthusiastically promoted all Marvel adaptations regardless of quality. His refusal to participate signaled to industry insiders that something was fundamentally wrong with the production. Lee's rejection was professional snub, demonstrating even Marvel's most promotional figure recognized this film dishonored the characters rather than celebrating them. His absence spoke volumes about the project's illegitimacy. 26. The Thing's rock texture was foam rubber. The Thing's iconic rock-like skin was created using carved foam rubber glued to bodysuit, giving him appearance of wearing lumpy pajamas rather than being living rock creature. The foam rubber lacked the weight and solidity stone should convey, moving and bunching unrealistically during action. Under bright lighting, the costume's foam rubber construction was painfully obvious. The practical effect choice made sense budgetarily, but guaranteed the character would look unconvincing. Modern audiences watching bootlegs are shocked how fake the Thing appears compared to later CGI versions or even practical effects from better-funded productions. The costume demonstrates that some characters simply require adequate budgets to translate convincingly. 25. Dr. Doom's origin was completely changed. The film changed Dr. Doom's origin from tragic college accident, disfiguring brilliant scientist, into generic, caught in same cosmic storm as the Fantastic Four backstory. This revision eliminated Doom's complexity, his disfigurement driving his villainy, his nobility corrupted by vanity. The simplified origin made Doom just another powered villain rather than Marvel's greatest antagonist with legitimate grievances and twisted honor code. The change demonstrated writers' misunderstanding of what made the character compelling. Doom's watered-down motivation robbed him of psychological depth, reducing complex character to generic bad guy wanting power for vague reasons. The failed characterization exemplified how budget constraints forced narrative compromises that fundamentally damaged storytelling. 24. The Human Torch's flight scenes were laughably bad. Human Torch's flight sequences used wire work so obvious that viewers could see the harness and cables supporting actor Jay Underwood. The flames surrounding him were poorly composited effects that didn't integrate with his body convincingly. Flight scenes showed him rigidly horizontal like mannequin being dragged through air rather than dynamic flying superhero. The unconvincing effects destroyed suspension of disbelief. Impossible to believe this stiff figure was person flying rather than obvious special effect. The failed flight sequences demonstrated that superhero flight requires significant budget to achieve convincingly. Cheap wirework and bad compositing guarantee ridicule rather than wonder. 23. The film was shot in Los Angeles warehouses. Most scenes were filmed in rented Los Angeles warehouses and industrial spaces dressed minimally to suggest various locations. The same warehouse appeared as multiple different settings through clever camera angles and minimal redressing. The limited locations meant the film felt claustrophobic and repetitive. Characters constantly in cramped industrial spaces rather than exploring diverse environments. Budget constraints prevented location shooting that could have added visual variety. The warehouse settings made the film feel like direct-to-video production rather than theatrical feature. The cheap locations exemplified how inadequate budgets forced compromises that accumulated into overall impression of poverty rather than creative resourcefulness. 22. Reed Richards' stretching was mostly arm extensions. Mr. Fantastic's stretching powers were portrayed primarily through actor wearing long rubber arm extensions operated by off-camera puppeteers. The extensions moved stiffly and unconvincingly, looking like rubber props rather than organic stretching. More elaborate stretching sequences were avoided entirely due to cost and technical limitations. The character's signature powers, stretching into any shape, becoming flat, extending across rooms, were mostly absent. Reed's limited power display made him feel like regular scientist who occasionally wore fake rubber arms rather than superhero with extraordinary abilities. The failed power depiction demonstrated that characters defined by visual effects are nearly impossible to portray effectively without adequate budgets. 21. The jeweler subplot made no narrative sense. The film's subplot about Doom's former partner, the jeweler, was confusing addition that went nowhere and served no clear narrative purpose. The character appeared irregularly without clear motivation or connection to main plot. Scenes involving the jeweler felt like they were filmed for different movie and awkwardly inserted. The confusing subplot suggested extensive script revisions or missing footage that would have clarified his role. The narrative confusion demonstrated that rushed production and minimal script development created storytelling that didn't cohere. Characters appeared and disappeared without proper setup or payoff, leaving audiences confused about who people were and why they mattered to the story. 20. Alicia Masters was Reed's girlfriend instead of Ben's. The film bizarrely made Alicia Masters, traditionally Ben Grimm's love interest in comics, into Reed Richards' girlfriend instead. This change eliminated one of comics' most touching relationships, blind sculptor loving the thing for his soul rather than appearance. The revision served no narrative purpose and robbed Ben of humanizing romantic subplot. The arbitrary change demonstrated that filmmakers either didn't understand source material or didn't care about maintaining character relationships that made the Fantastic Four emotionally resonant. The failed romance exemplified how superficial understanding of source material led to changes that eliminated emotional depth without improving anything. 19. The Fantastic Four never wore proper costumes. The team's iconic blue costumes appeared only briefly at film's end, with most of the movie featuring team in street clothes or makeshift outfits. Budget constraints prevented creating 4 complete superhero costumes for entire filming period. When costumes finally appeared, they were cheap spandex suits that looked like Halloween costumes rather than professional superhero uniforms. The lack of proper costumes for most of runtime meant the film felt like origin story that never reached satisfying payoff of team fully embracing superhero identities. The costume absence exemplified how budget limitations prevented the film from delivering what audiences expect from superhero adaptation. 18. Marvel executives reportedly bought and destroyed copies. Persistent industry rumors claim Marvel executives purchased bootleg copies at conventions and destroyed them to prevent circulation. While never officially confirmed, multiple convention dealers reported mysterious buyers purchasing all available copies at above-market prices, then immediately discarding them. Marvel allegedly wanted to eliminate evidence of the embarrassing low-budget adaptation that could damage the property's reputation with potential future film partners. The rumored destruction attempts were futile. Copies continued circulating and eventually appeared online beyond any studio's control. The alleged campaign demonstrated corporate embarrassment about the film's existence and desire to erase this chapter from Marvel's film history. 17. The score was generic stock music. The film's musical score consisted primarily of generic stock music licensed from production music libraries rather than original composition. The recycled music had been used in countless other low-budget productions, giving the film no sonic identity. Stock music cues didn't match on-screen action properly, dramatic moments accompanied by wrong emotional tone. No memorable themes emerged that audiences could associate with characters. The generic score made the film feel cheap and disposable. Original scoring could have elevated material, but budget constraints prevented hiring composer to create proper superhero soundtrack. The stock music exemplified how cost-cutting in every department accumulated into overwhelming impression of cheapness. 16. The film's climax lasted only 8 minutes. The final confrontation between the Fantastic Four and Doctor Doom lasted approximately 8 minutes, extraordinarily brief for superhero film climax. Budget limitations prevented elaborate action sequences or extended battles. The rushed ending felt anticlimactic, with Doom defeated quickly through convenient plot device rather than heroes' skills and teamwork. Modern superhero films feature 20 to 30-minute climactic battles. Understanding audiences expect extended payoff to narrative build-up. The abbreviated ending demonstrated that inadequate action budgets forced narratives to climax quickly to avoid expensive sequences. The disappointing finale exemplified how financial constraints prevented delivering satisfying superhero spectacle audiences expect. 15. Actors promoted non-existent release dates. Cast members promoted specific theatrical release dates in interviews and convention appearances, not knowing these dates were fabricated. Actors genuinely believed the film would premiere January 1995 as announced, then later heard May 1995, then fall 1995. Each postponement was explained as distribution negotiations or marketing strategy adjustments. Eventually, release dates stopped being announced, and cast stopped receiving information entirely. The actors' promotional efforts became increasingly awkward as they defended a film they'd never seen in final form for release that would never happen. Their genuine enthusiasm made the deception more cruel, exploiting performers' professional commitment to promote their work. 14. The Thing could barely move in his costume. Carl Ciarfalio's mobility was so restricted in the Thing costume that action scenes were nearly impossible. The foam rubber suit prevented him from raising arms above shoulder height, turning his head more than 45 degrees, or bending at waist normally. Fight choreography was severely limited by costume constraints. The Thing mostly stood stationary, throwing slow punches rather than dynamic combat. The mobility restrictions made the character seem weak and ineffective rather than super strong powerhouse. The costume demonstrated that practical creature effects require extensive design, testing, and refinement to allow performers adequate movement. Rush jobs guarantee characters who look stiff and unconvincing during action sequences. 13. The Mole Man's design was recycled from other films. The Mole Man's creature design and underground lair sets were recycled from previous Roger Corman productions, particularly his Edgar Allan Poe adaptations from the 1960s. Production designers pulled existing costumes and set pieces from Corman's warehouse, rather than creating original designs. The recycled elements made the Mole Man's world feel dated and generic, rather than creating unique underground civilization. Budget limitations prevented constructing new sets or creatures specifically for this film. The recycling demonstrated Corman's legendary frugality. Why build new when old works fine, regardless of whether it actually works fine? The obvious reuse made the film feel like assemblage of borrowed parts. 12. Several action sequences were never filmed. Budget depletion meant multiple action sequences, scripted and storyboarded, were never filmed. Chase scenes, elaborate battles, and effects-heavy moments were cut from production entirely. The missing sequences left narrative gaps, where characters referenced events audiences never saw. Exposition-heavy dialogue replaced visual storytelling, because talking is cheaper than action. The absent sequences made the film feel incomplete and anticlimactic. Scripts underwent multiple revisions, removing expensive sequences and replacing them with cheaper alternatives. The missing action demonstrated that superhero stories require adequate budgets to realize fully. Cutting action sequences from superhero film is like removing songs from musical. 11. The film was never color-corrected properly. The bootleg copies circulating show film that was never properly color-corrected or color-timed in post-production. Colors vary wildly between scenes. Lighting is inconsistent, and overall image quality suggests unfinished production rather than theatrical-ready film. Proper color correction requires time and money the production couldn't afford. The inconsistent visuals make the film feel amateurish, even beyond its other limitations. Professional color grading could have unified the film's appearance and minimized cheapness of some practical effects. The absent color correction suggests the film was abandoned in post-production once legal requirements were satisfied rather than completed to professional standards. 10. Marvel Comics tried to stop production. Marvel Comics reportedly attempted to halt production once they understood the film's true nature, but contractual agreements prevented interference. Marvel's licensing deal gave producers creative control and production authority regardless of Marvel's wishes. The company could object, but not legally prevent the film's completion. Marvel's failed intervention attempts demonstrated the danger of licensing agreements that grant excessive autonomy to external producers. The company learned valuable lessons about maintaining creative oversight that influenced how later Marvel film deals were structured. The experience contributed to Marvel eventually creating Marvel Studios to control their own adaptations rather than licensing to external producers. 9. The underground lair was a parking garage. The Mole Man's underground kingdom was filmed in Los Angeles parking garage, dressed with minimal rocky props and fog machines. The parking structure's concrete walls and floors were barely disguised by strategic lighting and camera angles. Wide shots revealed the obviously modern architecture rather than ancient underground civilization. Budget constraints prevented building elaborate underground sets, forcing production to make parking garage pass as fantasy location. The unconvincing setting destroyed suspension of disbelief. Impossible to believe characters were actually underground rather than in parking structure with fog. The cheap location demonstrated that fantasy environments require construction budgets to establish believably. 8. Voice actors were never paid for looping. During post-production, actors were called back for ADR, automated dialogue replacement, to re-record lines with better audio quality. Many actors were never paid for these looping sessions, violating SAG agreements. Producers claimed post-production work was included in original contracts, though actors disputed this interpretation. Several cast members filed grievances with Screen Actors Guild over unpaid looping work. The disputes were eventually settled, but the initial refusal to pay for additional work exemplified the production's willingness to exploit cast financially. The payment conflicts demonstrated that the film's problems extended beyond creative and budget issues into labor relations and ethical treatment of performers. 7. The film was transferred to VHS without permission. Someone involved in post-production, identity never confirmed, created VHS copies of the finished film and distributed them without authorization. These unauthorized copies became the source of all bootlegs circulating for decades. Theories about the leaker's identity range from disgruntled crew member wanting their work seen to sympathetic producer believing cast deserved to have audiences see their performances. The leak demonstrated that keeping film completely suppressed was impossible once multiple people had access to Final Cut. The unauthorized distribution undermined any remaining hope of controlling the film's fate and cemented its status as underground cult phenomenon. 6. Germany's Constantine film. Eventually made the good version, German producer Bernd Eichinger, who commissioned the 1994 version purely for rights retention, eventually produced the 2005 Fantastic Four film with proper $100 million budget and major studio backing. The 2005 version proved Eichinger's long-term strategy worked. Maintaining rights through cheap film enabled him to eventually produce properly funded adaptation. However, cast and crew of 1994 version felt bitter that their exploitation was strategic stepping stone rather than legitimate project. Eichinger never publicly apologized for deceiving the 1994 cast. the eventual proper film demonstrated that rights retention schemes can succeed long-term, even if short-term casualties include deceived performers. 5. The film is still technically unreleased. Despite widespread bootleg availability, the 1994 Fantastic Four has never received official release on VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, or streaming platforms. The film remains legally unreleased, with no authorized way to view it. The copyright holders have no interest in official release that would acknowledge the film's existence and potentially complicate rights situation. The perpetual unreleased status creates legal ambiguity. Bootleg copies circulate freely because rights holders choose not to enforce copyright on film they pretend doesn't exist. The situation demonstrates that intellectual property law operates strangely when copyright holders benefit from allowing unofficial distribution rather than protecting their property. 4. It established the Marvel rights retention template. The 1994 Fantastic Four's rights retention strategy established template used repeatedly by studios, desperately maintaining Marvel character rights. Studios learned they could produce minimal-budget films never intended for release purely to satisfy contractual obligations. This tactic was used for properties like Daredevil, Ghost Rider, and allegedly several others, where production activity occurred primarily to prevent rights reversion. The practice demonstrates how contract law incentivizes producing something terrible rather than allowing rights to revert to original owners who might do better. The 1994 Fantastic Four didn't invent rights retention filmmaking, but proved it could work, encouraging others to follow the same cynical strategy. Legendary producer Roger Corman. 3. Roger Corman said he made better films for less money. Later stated in interviews that he had made far superior films on similar or smaller budgets throughout his career. Corman's classic B-movies like Little Shop of Horrors, 1960, cost less adjusted for inflation, but delivered considerably more entertainment value and technical competence. Corman attributed Fantastic Four's failure not to budget, but to lack of genuine creative commitment. His successful low-budget films were made by people trying to create good movies, while Fantastic Four was made by people trying to satisfy contract. The comparison demonstrated that passion and creativity can overcome budget limitations, but cynical contractual obligation guarantees mediocrity. 2. The cast still defends their work. Despite learning their film was never intended for release, many cast members still defend their performances and creative efforts decades later. Actors maintain they did their best with available resources and that their work deserved to be seen by audiences. Several cast members have appeared at conventions discussing the film fondly, despite the production's deceptive nature. Their continued pride in the work demonstrates professional commitment. They perform their jobs well even though the project exploited them. The cast's defensive loyalty is both touching and tragic, representing performers who gave genuine effort to project that cynically used them as legal pawns. 1. It became more famous as failure than success ever could have been. The 1994 Fantastic Four achieved more cultural significance as infamous unreleased failure than it ever could have gained through legitimate theatrical release. The film's strange production history, bootleg distribution, and rights retention scheme made it legendary bad movie, attracting more attention than countless officially released superhero films that quietly disappeared. The movie became cautionary tale about film industry's darker aspects, how legal maneuvering can take precedence over creative integrity, how corporations can exploit earnest performers, and how contract law can incentivize making terrible content rather than nothing. The film's fame as failure exceeded what success could have brought. So there you have it. 40 wild facts proving the 1994 Fantastic Four wasn't just a bad movie. It was a cynical legal scheme that exploited an entire cast and crew who believed they were making legitimate superhero film, establishing rights retention template that has been used repeatedly to maintain film rights through producing minimum viable garbage never intended for actual audiences. The wildest part? A movie made purely as legal chess piece became more culturally significant as legendary unreleased disaster than properly funded adaptations that actually reached theaters. proving sometimes the greatest villain origin story is how the film industry treats both its characters and the people who try to bring them to life. Now, stretch your way to your next video. And remember, sometimes the most fantastic thing about making a Fantastic Four movie is how spectacularly Hollywood can prove that corporate cynicism is more destructive than any supervillain Dr. Doom could ever dream of being.